Hello and welcome to the Engage Brain Podcast. Today's episode is number 27. No ad for today. We're looking to a little bit different format. I no longer have a steady stream of students to be in the podcast, and so now I'm starting to look out and reach out to scientists and friends of mine to be involved in the podcast. Maybe I'll start even doing some solo episodes where I explore different issues in psychology, neuroscience, and higher education. So today, in kind of the newest format of the show, I speak with Dr. Kameko Halfmann from St. Norbert College about aging and decision making. Wait to see that it's going. It looks like it's going. First time on a computer. See how it sounds. I'm here with Kameko Halfmann, Dr. Kameko Halfmann. This is the first time I'm actually speaking with a doctor for the podcast, so at least I got your name right, unlike every previous podcast where I said someone's name incorrectly, but I would hope I'd be able to get your name right. Anyways, Dr. Kameko Halfmann, visiting assistant professor at St. Norbert College in the psychology discipline, and we're going to be talking about older adults and decision-making. In particular, we're celebrating today a recent publication of the role of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex in purchase intent among older adults, Dr. Halfmann's first co-author paper.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining me. I'm happy to sit down with you. So I think we'll start, just like all the other podcasts, by asking you what got you interested in the thing that you're studying.
Well, I've always been very interested in human behavior and in particular how people go about making decisions and making decisions about their future. And I find it even more interesting to study how this process changes throughout our lifespan. And with the rise in the population of older adults, it seemed like a very important population to study that has been understudied for a long time. And so my research generally focuses on decision making, in particular decisions about the future, among this population of older adults in comparison to their younger counterparts.
Can you talk about a little bit about those changes that are going with older adults?
Sure. So I should clarify, I primarily study healthy aging. And so there's a lot of interest right now in dementia and Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease and some of these neurodegenerative diseases that cause larger changes in the brain and behavior. But in order to really gain a good understanding of those neurodegenerative processes, we also need to understand what typically happens in the older adults' brains and their behavior. And so my research focuses on these healthy older adults. And now I'm forgetting the question.
Oh, well, I was asking, so you were saying that kind of all the research before was just looking at undergrads, our weird populations, and your research is filling this kind of necessary hole because it was undergrad populations and then people with these large brain disorders, and so you were looking at healthy older adults. So I was asking about what kind of changes do we see in older adults?
Right, and so even among these healthy older adults, we do see some sorts of changes in their brain and their behavior. So for instance, healthy older adults or normal aging tends to go along with declines in brain matter, particularly in the front parts of the brain, in what's called the frontal cortex. And the frontal cortex, and in particular the prefrontal cortex, is involved in complex thinking processes such as decision-making and planning and executive functions, kind of that CEO of your brain that helps you make decisions about what you're going to do next. And so older adults tend to see a decline in this area of the brain, and also to some extent in the hippocampus, which is a brain region associated with memory that we often associate with aging as well.
Mm-hmm. And it seems really important because for a long time, or for a large part of your life, it seems like things are kind of on autopilot. You're not making too many life-changing decisions. But in older adults, you have lots of things. Planning for your eventual death and planning for any health problems or other things. Are those the kind of decisions that you're talking about?
Right, exactly. So older adults have just all of a sudden a bunch of choices that they need to make about planning for their retirement savings, what they're going to do with that money. They might need to put together an end of life care plan. They might need to think about selling or liquidating some of their assets, and making a lot of complex decisions that they may not have made earlier in their life, or maybe there are things that are changing at that period of time that necessitate reanalyzing some of these types of things that are going on. And so, just for example, my grandpa recently reassessed some of his end of life plans and investments. And so he went through a whole new decision making process, and it was very challenging for him. And so I'm interested in how these older adults are approaching and assessing these types of decisions.
Mm-hmm. But before we get to studying very complex decisions like retirement savings and investments and everything, how do you actually study decision making in the lab?
Right. So studying decision making in the laboratory can be complex because older adults, or excuse me, decision making involves so many different cognitive processes. You have to pull things from your memory, you have to be able to pay attention, and you have to be able to integrate a bunch of different components of a decision. So, for example, there might be some money involved, plus there might be other people involved. And so when we bring people into the lab, what we are interested in is distilling these very complex decisions into their simple components so that we can at least initially start to understand where potential issues might lie. So, for example, we'll study specifically how older adults are making decisions in relation to time. Do they value things that are currently right in front of them and immediately gratifying, or do they value things that are more distant into the future? So are they more likely to plan or just go with the moment?
And that kind of decision occurs all the time. It's not just things like money, but that could be things like my diet. Yesterday I had a really good peach cobbler at St. Norbert, or not peach cobbler, apple cobbler, and I wanted many more, but I had to value my present, I don't know, likingness of the cobbler versus my long-term goals of being healthy.
Right. We make these types of decisions all the time with regard to our diet, exercise, smoking behaviors, Netflix binging, procrastination. So you might think right now it's a good idea to commit to some public engagement or presentation that you want to potentially do in a couple of months. But when you get to that time period where you're actually having to do it, it seems a little different than it might have when you first initially made that commitment.
Or starting a podcast and then ignoring it for a couple of months.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you just described temporal discounting. Is there another type of decision-making task that you use in the lab?
One task that we've used to tap a little bit more into those complex decision-making skills is called the Iowa gambling task. And what this task asks participants to do is make selections between 4 different decks of cards, and 2 of those decks of cards are what are called good decks and ultimately lead to high monetary gains. And so each time you flip over a card, you either win or lose some money. So 2 of those decks are good decks, and then 2 decks are what are called bad decks. So in the long run, they lead to losses in money. And in this task, what you have to do is learn over time which of those decks are good decks versus bad decks. And this task relates to complex decision-making skills because the participants have to be able to understand not only long-term future consequences, but also be able to make decisions related to uncertainty or ambiguity and risk and chance that are involved in this task. And so it just allows the participants to integrate many different things rather than just focusing on one factor like the time period that they're making the decisions over.
Yeah, and the history of that task is, I think, fascinating, how the reason why it was developed and what kind of preceded it in neuropsychology of decision-making assessment.
Right, yeah. And so the history of this task actually revolves around a particular patient or group of patients who had brain damage to their frontal lobes. And researchers found that these patients, once they sustained this brain damage, were making all of these really weird choices or bad choices in their life that led to some personal turmoil. So, for example, even though they did really well on IQ tests, their intelligence was maintained. They were going out and gambling, losing money, engaging in risky behavior. And so the researchers at Iowa wanted to figure out a way to tap into this deficit that wasn't well captured by traditional neuropsychological tests of intellect and memory.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to kind of pick up on more real-world decision deficits that things like the Wisconsin card sorting task or other putative measures of decision-making couldn't actually capture in those patients.
Right.
And when you look at your older adults, you said that you work with healthy older adults, people who aren't or who don't have dementia or diagnosed dementia. Do they all perform well on this task?
Right. So that's an interesting finding that came from my lab before I actually joined in my graduate studies. So what they found was that a subset of healthy older adults who do really well in their day-to-day lives, their intellect is intact, a subset do really poorly on the Iowa gambling task, and they actually perform worse, so they lose more money on this task than those patients with damage to their frontal lobes. But the good news is a subset of older adults also do really well on this task, and they perform similar to or better than your typical middle-aged or younger adult. And so we see this interesting heterogeneity and divergence among our older adults, where some are doing quite well and others are doing quite poorly on this complex decision-making task, despite the rest of their cognitive functions being largely intact.
And so the study that we saw came out today was looking at purchase intent among these patients. Do you have a kind of brief description or like maybe like an abstract version of that paper?
Sure. So what we found, and let me actually give you a little bit of background. In this study, what we had the participants do was look at advertisements that were deemed deceptive by the FTC, so the Federal Trade Commission. And so the participants were looking at these ads while they were undergoing fMRI, so their brains were being scanned, and we were able to measure a surrogate of their brain activity while they were looking at these advertisements. And after they finished the scan, outside of the scanner, they were asked to indicate whether they would want to purchase any of those items that were shown in the ads. And what we found was that in those older adults who are not impaired, who do well on the Iowa gambling task, their brain activity correlated with their purchase intent. So if they had a high purchase intent, they also showed higher activity in their brain, particularly in that prefrontal cortex region I keep mentioning. But the unimpaired older adults were not showing a correlation between this area of their brain, the prefrontal cortex, and their purchase intent. So it seemed like there was a disconnect between how they're valuing or assessing these advertisements and their behavioral report of their intentions.
Wow, I haven't read it completely, I have to admit. I know that's a bad thing to admit as a professor that you haven't read the paper. But I saw the abstract, I tweeted it out, it's on my things to read. So I'll be fascinated to look through that. Maybe I'll wait till it's done being provisionally accepted.
And I have to give the hat tip. This is not my own research. I was a co-author on it. I helped collect some of the data and analyze some of the data, but this is a paper that was largely put together by Brian Kestner and Dr. Hedgecock and Dr. Denberg, who are collaborators and mentors of mine.
Yeah, and so how about we're talking about a past study. Do you have some things kind of on tap for the fall? Some new research studies that you're looking to not participate in, but develop and collect?
Yeah, so right now I'm working with a student And we are interested in studying whether athletes who participate in collision versus non-collision sports show any differences in how they use heuristics or biases. So we'll be looking to see whether collision athletes who maybe sustain more TBIs or concussions or blows to the head rely more on heuristics in their judgment and decision making. And so that's what we've got on tap for this fall, and we'll be primarily focusing on a young adult, undergraduate, college population for that research, at least as we start it up.
Yeah, it's always good to start somewhere, and hopefully our healthy older adults aren't out getting too many TBIs or concussions, although I know they are in the highest risk segment.
Yes.
And also with the large audience of this podcast, I hope that nothing gets scooped with your description of the future research.
Well, we always like to collaborate and see things replicated, right?
Yeah. So talking about collaborating, ways that people can reach out to you?
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter at Kameko May. Or visit my website, kamekomay.wordpress.com. And then my students this fall will be creating some great infographics and podcasts themselves, which you can find tweeted about at SNC Psych or at sncphysio.wordpress.com.
And also under the hashtag Let SNC Your Brain?
Yeah, that's right. Let SNC Your Brain will be our course hashtag this fall.
Well, great. Thank you so much for stopping by, being around, and chatting with me. I'm happy to have the kind of inaugural doctor version of the Engage Brain podcast.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So thanks so much to Kameko for dropping in and being my first professional guest on the podcast rather than a student. It was so nice to be able to talk to her and hear about her research, both the research that she'd completed previously with some researchers at the University of Iowa, but also some research that she was planning with undergraduate students at St. Norbert College. Let's see, turning to different other segments of the podcast. Jake's Jams. Jake's Jams are things that I've been interested in lately. I see that at the end of the podcast run with the cognitive neuroscience students, I was kind of running out of things to jam, but it's been, almost 2 months now. So I've been working a lot with Python and found the Anaconda Python package to be really great, really useful, where you get tons and tons of libraries and packages and access to coding IDE like Spider, and it's just been really useful and helpful for someone who's just trying to learn and teach themselves new coding language. So Anaconda was great for that. I can't think of too much else. I've been using Figshare to upload some of my old posters and give them DOIs and have them online for other people to view and see, and not just have them kind of locked where no one saw them on my website, jkurzik.com. So using Figshare has been great for that. I shouldn't say too many more things as the summer is coming to a very quick close apparently, and I'll likely be starting to record some more once the school year gets started up here. So I think that's it for Jake's Jams. Turning to the mailbag, nothing in the mailbag as has been per usual, but you can email me at engagebrainpodcast@gmail.com. With any questions, or tweet me at EngageBrain on Twitter with any questions or suggestions. There have been a few followers or subscribers, so here's a new episode for you, subscribers out there, for the EngageBrain podcast. So we have some plans for some episodes in the future. I'll be releasing this to my friends, and hopefully this encourages them to come onto the podcast and talk about their research. So this has been the EngageBrain podcast. Thank you for listening.